Once a testament to mankind's defiance of Kain's empire, this towering cathedral now stood derelict, the humans who worshipped here, dead for centuries. Its architects conceived this tower as a holy weapon against the vampire menace, a colossal instrument of brass and stone. The cathedral's pipes, once tuned to blast a deadly hymn, now stood silent, and these vacant spaces whistled their impotence.
The Silenced Cathedral is one of the most imposing buildings in Nosgoth, and is one of the most recognisable landmarks of the Soul Reaver era. The cathedral appears as a main location in Legacy of Kain's Soul Reaver, and it subsequently reappeared as a playable location in the cancelled multiplayer spin-off Nosgoth. The impressive building has engendered an enduring reputation that has become a lasting symbol of the perilous and precarious nature of life and how it hangs in the balance in Nosgoth. The cathedral has its origins in the upheavals of the early Soul Reaver era, as the threat of Kain's necromantic vampires began to rise and the major human kingdoms began to fall to their devastating power. Unable to stand against the vampires directly, humanity rallied together and began to try a different approach. They isolated the vampire weaknesses and realised that alongside the usual vulnerabilities like sunlight, water, impalement, decapitation and inflammation, that these vampires were vulnerable to certain frequencies of sound. The humans quickly organised and came up with a plan of breathtaking ambition. They planned to build a weapon to harness and transmit sound on a scale never seen before, in the guise of a place of worship, and designed a massive spiralling cathedral to house it, carving auxiliary structures out of sheer rock and building on a mountaintop. Inside, a network of pipes and chambers was intended to tune airflow like a huge pipe organ, so that rather than hymns and songs, the music played from the pipes of the cathedral would blast a deadly tune that would wipe the vampires from the face of Nosgoth. Unfortunately for the humans, the construction of this colossal monument didn't go unnoticed by the vampires, and as the building approached completion, the vampires chose their moment to strike, executing a devastating surprise attack and overrunning the cathedral, effectively wiping out humanity's last hope of victory in the war against the vampires. In the years afterward, the pipes of the cathedral were blocked, and the Zephonim vampire clan took up residence within, with Zephon himself retreating to the top of the cathedral and occupying the top level, in a very literal sense. Eventually, some vampire-worshipping humans took up residence in the cathedral as well, but the cathedral remained the very heart of Zephonim territory in Nosgoth. Centuries later, when Raziel was executed and resurrected as a wraith, the Silenced Cathedral was one of the first locations he was directed to visit. After gaining the Wraithblade, he was able to unseal the doors, and he too was able to recount the stories of the structure as he entered, apparently already aware of its history and its occupants, although not necessarily prepared for the spider-like devolution of the Zephonim, or the monstrous devolution of their master. As he made his way through the cathedral, Raziel opened up many of the cathedral's sounding pipes, using the air currents opened up to ascend through the layers of the cathedral to reach the private chambers at the top, where he was able to confront his insectoid brother Zephon, who had grown to encompass the upper rooms of the cathedral. Using the flamethrower of a dead vampire hunter, Raziel was able to ignite Zephon's eggs and use them to set the chamber aflame, burning Zephon to death and gaining the ability to climb. Raziel would leave the cathedral, and used the climbing ability to open the way to the tomb of the Seraphan, although he could explore the lower levels beneath the cathedral to find access to the sound glyph altar, and the moat surrounding the cathedral led to the lighthouse area and the sunlight glyph altar. However, the cathedral itself contained nothing further to see in the retail version, although more was initially planned, but we'll come back to that later. The imposing view of the exterior of the cathedral can only really be seen at the start of Legacy of Kain's Soul Reaver, where the cathedral is present in the background of the opening cutscene, along with the smokestack that was supposed to be visited in the cut to Aurelium clan territory. Games at the time lacked the power to show the full glory of the cathedral at a distance without significant technical issues, and so in-game, the fog of the smokestack was used to lower the viewing distance, meaning that many locations where the cathedral should have been seen were shrouded in mist, and even when nearby, only the outer walls of the lower structures could be seen. Although it can't be seen in-game, there were several behind-the-scenes sources that showed better views of the structure. Full renders of the cathedral exist, which allows us to see the pinnacle of the cathedral in all its glory, and several pieces of concept art show similar views of the cathedral or show the approaches to the structure. The distinctive architecture of the cathedral has its roots in the biblical allegories of Soul Reaver, and as such, it was deliberately designed by developers to be evocative of biblical architecture, such as the Tower of Babel. Indeed, the real-world inspirations for much of the architecture of Kain's empire is often stated to be Islamic and Arabic-esque designs that typify the style of Kain's empire. And so the distinctive appearance of the cathedral reflects the spiral minarets of the Islamic world on buildings such as the Great Mosque of Samarra. However, much more was planned for the cathedral initially, and a lot of its potential was left on the cutting room floor. While in the retail version of Soul Reaver, the cathedral served as the main territory of the Zephyrim vampires, and one of the most chilling areas of the game. A lot more was planned for the cathedral initially, and much was reworked during development. Undoubtedly, the biggest change was that in the initial plans, the Silenced Cathedral would have been revisited later in the game, and was crucial to the ending of the game as originally envisaged. We've covered this numerous times, particularly in our Alpha series, but in the original vision of Soul Reaver 1, Raziel and Kain wouldn't have gone back in time at the Chronoplast, and instead, Raziel will have continued on, defeating the priestess in the Undercity to gain possession, and defeating his brother Terrell in his clan territory to gain the amplified force projectile. From there, he would have glided from the smokestack to reach Kain in his mountain retreat, to gain the amplified Kain Reaver. Using that Reaver enhancement, he was intended to have returned to the pinnacle of the Silenced Cathedral, and unblocked the final sounding pipes, activating the weapon, and unleashing the deadly sound to destroy every vampiric creature on the face of Nosgoth. This ending, and indeed much of the final parts of the game, were not able to be completed in time, and they were completely removed, with callbacks appearing in sequels for years after. However, fragments of that ending did remain into the final game, as some of Raziel's final speeches from the pinnacle of the Silenced Cathedral can be found in the game files.
As they swarmed after me, I felt the terror that must have filled their wizened hearts. They knew what I had to do here, that it would spell their downfall, and that I too might perish in the very act. This tower had stood too long as a grotesque symbol of Kain's perverse intent. The time was ripe, indeed past due, for me to exploit my newborn talents and send a hymn of death across this land. Enough to banish sanity. Enough to set the children of the night plucking at their eyes, tearing open their own throats. Enough to destroy every vampiric creature on the face of this bruised and bleeding land. My goal was within reach. All that remained was to open each and every sounding pipe.
It is done, Raziel. Your destiny is fulfilled. Though you have destroyed every creature who might call you kin, the world is born anew. The cycle of birth and death, stalled and stagnant these long years, once again begins to flow. You have done well, my servant.
In addition, the chronoplast visions seen in the final game were inserted as deliberate callbacks to the deleted ending, although they weren't created from deleted levels necessarily, but were instead mock-ups created from parts of existing levels, with one vision standing in for the pinnacle of the cathedral actually created from parts of the deleted smokestack. Later games would reframe the chronoplast visions as premonitions of the future. To really get a sense of what was being planned for the pinnacle of the cathedral, however, you have to look at early developmental builds of the game. The existence of a high-quality render of the pinnacle of the cathedral had led some fans to believe that the scenes at the pinnacle could have been intended to be a full FMV cutscene. But the alpha and beta versions show that there was a part that was at least an in-game cutscene, if not completely playable. These sections show a tunnel leading upwards behind Zephon's head that connects, or doesn't connect, to a variety of rooms in different builds, with various spiral passages, a full ascending chamber with many ledges to allow Raziel to climb up, and finally culminating in a cloudy textured open area with several pipe-like protrusions, which seems to represent the very top of the cathedral. Unfortunately, these are mostly unfinished rooms, and there are no further story beats or triggers in them. But they do demonstrate early ideas for the end of the game that were cut. And this isn't the only interesting cut content that can be seen through developmental builds, as the cathedral has many areas where content was removed that's illuminated in alpha and beta builds. Here are some of the most interesting highlights. To start with, the original play order of the level was reshuffled in development. In the retail build, Raziel defeats Melchiah in the necropolis and uses the phasing ability he gains to reach the Sanctuary of the Clans, where he gains the Wraithblade, which he then uses to unlock the cathedral, and subsequently uses its climbing ability to reach the Tomb of the Seraphan. Early builds of the game, however, had no Soul Reaver doorway barring entry to the cathedral, and Raziel went from the necropolis straight into the cathedral, with the climbing ability instead being used to enter the Sanctuary of the Clans. This was presumably reshuffled to give a breather before the cathedral, which was one of the largest areas in the game. Early builds of the game don't have the sound glyph altar or the sunlight glyph altars present in the cathedral, which are both in different areas. However, one of the upper chambers does provide access to the Sound Reaver Forge. This forge was ultimately deleted from the game. The outside village area, which is populated by Zephonim in the retail build, has no vampires, but instead has a human vampire hunter present, helping explain further human hunter incursions throughout the level. Some of the buildings have differing heights, and an additional grate is present, presumably to prevent jumping across. The main lower chamber is dominated by a large statue overlooking the room from a ledge. The pipes in this room have a much more complicated arrangement in Spectral, making the jumping puzzle to scale them a lot more challenging than in Retail. The mechanisms on the ledge are actually activated by placing boulders on pressure pads in early versions. The third tier has a large entrance blocked by webbing in the Retail game, which is actually part of a branching corridor in early builds of the game, with the branches passing either side of the central fan room, which is used to go further up in the cathedral in Retail. In some builds, a massive construction can be seen at the centre of the branch. This was ultimately revealed to be a puzzle to open it to gain a collectible item. Zephon's lair has two side corridors that curve back to the top of the chamber. These are blocked in Retail and contain special soul spouts in some versions of the game. These largely reflect the developers experimenting with ideas for the boss fight. Throughout the cathedral, large pipe-like openings can be seen on the walls, which are covered by webs that move with the air current. Some of these can be burned through to unblock them. This gives the impression of external openings that have been blocked by the Zephonim, and some may have contributed to late-game puzzles to ready the cathedral. Most of these were removed, moving into later versions. Soul Reaver isn't the only game to open up the Silenced Cathedral to exploration and discarded ideas, though. While its main appearance was in Soul Reaver, the cathedral did make a reappearance in the multiplayer spin-off Nosgoth, which, due to its cancellation whilst in beta testing, could be considered to be a bit of a canon grey area. Nosgoth was set in an era between Raziel's execution and resurrection as a wraith, and the cathedral was one of the areas shown that appeared to hint at the Soul Reaver cut content, with it first appearing in the background of the Crucible map, a level that itself was inspired by the cut Turilim clan territory. Here, the design of the cathedral clearly pays dues to the previous renders and concept arts. But more was to come later, as the Silenced Cathedral got its own playable level, which was originally named as the Nest, before being given a more faithful name in the original Silenced Cathedral moniker. The map was inspired by some of the Soul Reaver concept arts, with the playable area appearing to be beneath the arches low down in the cathedral, apparently in an auxiliary area built to aid construction of the cathedral, similar to the village area seen in Soul Reaver. The map in question has many references to the area that appeared in Soul Reaver, including Zephonim flags, distinctive circular-shaped buildings, numerous pipes and pipe openings, depictions of the figures from the Soul Reaver murals, a bell tower complete with several bells, stained glasses with bell motifs, webbing featured throughout, including to cocoon corpses, and numerous hints towards insectoid or spider-like inhabitants. These elements gave the map a distinctly unsettling atmosphere, but perhaps more unsettling were the lore elements that went along with the new map and the playable Zephonim class, which had its basis in snippets of previous lore that had been expanded to logical conclusions, with the implication that the Zephonim were a clan of cunning manipulators, skilled at using fear, illusions, deception, and even mind control to take advantage of the situation. The playable Zephonim class was even called Deceivers to highlight their nature, and even had evolved skins greatly resembling the Soul Reaver classes, with the implication that their mental prowess may have explained why they were able to maintain a cadre of worshippers at the cathedral in later years. The class was able to use several of these skills in battle, being able to summon illusions, turn invisible, control the enemy, but perhaps their most distinctive ability was to be able to briefly take on the appearance of a human adversary to trick or ambush prey. And these ideas were explored even further in lore suggestions that didn't make it into the lore blogs of the time, with discussions that the cathedral wasn't really the weapon the humans had hoped, but an experiment in playing with your food, as the vampires were fully aware of the human plans and allowed them to happen, deliberately intending to sabotage them at the last moment and cruelly dash the false hopes of humanity. Indeed, it was even suggested that the initial reason for the failure of the cathedral may have been that Zephanim deceivers had already infiltrated the area during its construction, and as completion neared, the order was given to sabotage it and bring it down, with the chilling scenario that one day, scores of human workers simply put down their tools, transformed into monstrous arachnid forms, and instigated a massacre, seizing the cathedral as their own. Nosgoth wasn't the only abandoned title that took heavy inspiration from the Silenced Cathedral either. In many ways, Nosgoth's accompanying sister project was the single-player game Legacy of Kain Dead Sun, which was outright cancelled the year before Nosgoth was made public. This too had taken cues from the Silenced Cathedral, with a whole game based around a scenario that discounted Soul Reaver 2, Blood Omen 2 and Defiance, and instead followed on from the cut ending of Soul Reaver, positing that Raziel had in fact managed to activate the Silenced Cathedral at the end of the game, and had managed to eliminate his brethren, save for a small group that had managed to train themselves to shift into the spectral realm. Dead Sun would have featured what remained of the Silenced Cathedral in its game world, but like many other returning landmarks, it would simply be a forgotten ruin, a relic of a bygone age. Of course, the idea of what it represented, an all-powerful superweapon to eliminate the vampires, was very appealing to the writer, so he used similar conceits several times in the story of the game beyond the initial background of the fall of Kain's empire. One tower weapon was built by the humans and intended to wipe out the vampires. Only the vampires similarly sabotaged it, but in a manner that killed the humans inside, trying to activate it. This influx of souls lured in the Elder God, and they then managed to kill it with secondary explosions. However, this wasn't completely successful, and the essence of the Elder was absorbed into the humans, from which it could apparently return. Later on, another tower weapon would be used at the very end of the game to truly wipe out the vampires, apparently leaving us with the same scenario that had started it all. At the end of the age of Kain's empire, when even the instruments that held the empire together were crumbling, the cathedral still stood, and it was never demolished, despite its apparent threat to the vampires of Kain's empire. This, over the years, had given many groups hope that it could be infiltrated and used once again to free Nosgoth of vampire rule. This hope was what motivated the humans in the spin-off Nosgoth. The idea that with sufficient force, they could retake the cathedral and win the war for Nosgoth. Their organisation and successes had already alerted the vampires to the threat posed by the humans, and their attempts to attack the cathedral en masse provoked fierce resistance from the combined might of all the vampire clans, and it appears they were never successful in retaking the structure. The same motivation was true for bands of human vampire hunters years later, as more modest attempts to infiltrate the cathedral could be seen even into the time of Raziel's return, with hunters seen at various points inside the structure, with some of the hunters even having made it so far as to reach Zephon's chamber. But even this more subtle method was fraught with danger and peril, and once again, it was never successful. Raziel was perhaps the figure that came closest to being able to take advantage of the cathedral's powers to wipe out the vampires. But in the canon version of events, he never returned to use them. This leaves only one being that could potentially have the power to use it: Kain himself. But why would Kain choose to use it to destroy his own empire? Well, the idea isn't as far-fetched as you might think. Even when Raziel was a vampire, Kain and his brood had become bored and detached from the day-to-day running of the empire and the lesser vampires. And by the time of Defiance, his opening speech regarded it as a corrupt and failing empire. You see, the empire and its devolutions were a product of the corruption of the Pillars that was born by Kain, and this degradation was passed on to his offspring. But after the events of Defiance, Kain is now fully cleansed by the Spirit Reaver. If he is to take the mantle of the Scion of Balance, then all vestiges of the corruption must be cleansed. And developers have suggested this may well be the entire reason Kain kept the cathedral around. If and when he succeeded, it was the perfect way to wipe the slate clean and start again. If the series were to continue, it would appear that the Silenced Cathedral may be part of Kain's plans all along and necessary to move forward. We hope you've enjoyed this entry in the Arcane Tomes. Be sure to like and subscribe, and join us next time, where we'll explore more Legacy of Kain lore and developer stories on the Ancient's Den.